While watching this documentary, you may notice the following symptoms: anger, rage, disgust, sadness, a desire to take action and fight back. These are the side effects of truth, and they're totally normal. This is the marketing of madness. Are we all insane?
There is no denying that psychological and emotional problems, even severe mental distress, can affect most anyone. But does this mean we are all insane? What causes psychological distress? Early psychiatrists thought it was an imbalance of the humors that could only be cured by bleeding patients with knives or leeches. Other psychiatrists believed mental problems came from organs like the tonsils, the stomach, and the spleen, and cut them out. Later were attempts to alter brain function, but these efforts also failed. Today, psychiatrists tell us that the way to fix unwanted behavior is by balancing brain chemistry with a pill. Did they get it right this time?
They say you have a chemical imbalance of serotonin and dopamine, but there's never been a study to ever prove that, ever. It's just been indoctrinated into the culture and television advertising to the point where people now believe it is fact.
Despite this lack of evidence, psychiatrists will tell you that psychotropic drugs are just like mainstream medical drugs. Can this be true? The answer is that unlike a drug such as insulin that corrects a measurable and proven imbalance in the body, psychotropic medications have no visible or measurable physical abnormality to correct. Here is evidence of a bacterial infection. Here is the psychiatric disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Here is a broken arm. Here is major depressive disorder. This is a brain tumor. And this is bipolar disorder. Which raises the question, how can you medicate something that is not physically there? The answer is, you can't. And furthermore, because psychotropic drugs are specifically designed to get past the body's natural defenses and into the brain, they can upset the very delicate processes the brain needs to ensure the body runs smoothly.
Every time you throw something into the system that's foreign to the system, you're creating imbalances elsewhere within the system.
The body changes as a result of taking the medication, so when you stop taking the medication, the body's got to change back to the way it was before, if it can, because it can't always. And in doing so, it disrupts the whole system.
This is what creates the sometimes serious side effects.
Paxil was the drug that gave me insomnia. I would cry very easily on it, and I completely lost my appetite within the first 2 days of taking it.
It didn't help me study, it didn't help me do anything. I didn't even want to do work because I was so sick.
The psych meds didn't help me at all. They made matters, I'd say probably like 10 times worse for me, maybe even 20.
Only now I was further impaired by the medications, and I started having car accidents.
They put me on Zoloft, and it made me want to kill myself.
And I realized that those drugs were just destroying me. Even when I was on them, I realized that they were destroying me.
In spite of the crippling effects of their drugs, psychiatrists and drug companies have used them to create a huge and lucrative market worth billions. And they've done this by naming more and more of life's problems as medical disorders, requiring psychiatric treatment. For example, shyness becomes social anxiety disorder. Loss of a loved one, major depressive disorder. Homesickness, separation anxiety. Suspicion, paranoid personality disorder. Having ups and downs, bipolar disorder. Distractibility, ADHD. This is why it is almost impossible for anyone to see a psychiatrist today and not be diagnosed with a mental illness. And a diagnosis of mental illness means psychotropic drugs.
When a patient goes into a psychiatrist's office and asks for help, probably 98, 99, maybe even 99.9% of people are going to receive a medication.
And these medications have been estimated to cause over 700,000 serious adverse reactions a year and 42,000 deaths. Meanwhile, the psychiatric industry rakes in $1/3 of $1 trillion a year. The issue isn't whether or not people's emotional problems are real. They are. What we really should be asking is, how did psychiatrists convince people that these problems were signs of mental illness? How did they use these illnesses to create a demand by doctors and the public for psychotropic drugs? And how did these drugs, with no known curative powers and a long list of side effects, become the standard treatment for every problem in life? Psychiatrists assert that they have made much progress in the field of mental health over the past century and a half. To prove this, they claim a history of great advancements in the area of psychotropic drugs. But is this parade of brain chemicals the scientific breakthroughs they are leading us to believe? Modern institutional psychiatry has depended on psychotropic drugging since its earliest beginnings in insane asylums during the 19th century. During that period, psychiatrists functioned almost exclusively as attendants, promising to cure the seriously mentally ill. But as they could not, they were not regarded by mainstream medicine as real doctors.
Other physicians considered psychiatrists as almost a doctor. Okay, because they weren't doing medical stuff. So to increase their status, they needed to become much more scientific.
They need to prove that this is a legitimate scientific field. This is a legitimate medical profession. So they start medicalizing everything.
To control behavioral outbursts amongst inmates, psychiatrists employed early psychotropic drugs, such as morphine and opium. But contrary to their claims, these drugs cured nothing and proved to be highly addictive. This led to a whole new generation of dependence, a solution far worse than the original problem. But the attempts to control objectionable behavior continued, and by the turn of the 20th century, phony cures for mental illness, such as heroin, could be found being peddled throughout the United States and Europe. Even psychologist Sigmund Freud played a major role in the creation of the cocaine industry in the Western world, writing many glowing articles promoting its use for spiritual distress and behavioral difficulties.
Freud, as a psychoanalyst, he for a while was promoting cocaine as being a panacea for all kinds of problems.
Freud later wrote,
"The psychic effect of cocainum muriaticum consists of exhilaration and lasting euphoria, produced no compulsive desire to use the stimulant further."
What Freud did not reveal was a significant conflict of interest involving two rival pharmaceutical giants, Merck and Parke Davis, both paying him to endorse their respective cocaine extracts. Sigmund Freud's early psychotropic drug marketing campaign helped create a major cocaine epidemic throughout Europe at the turn of the century. Clearly, another happy pill would have to be found. It wouldn't take long. Psychiatrists in the first half of the 20th century next turned to amphetamines. As before, the hype subsided into unavoidable proof that the drugs not only were ineffective, but highly toxic and addictive. Each fad followed the same pattern. First, the drug would be hailed as a medical breakthrough for mental problems. Then, increasing reports of serious side effects would trickle in. Finally, after years of denial, when psychiatrists and pharmaceutical companies could no longer deny the dangers of the drug, they would abandon it in favor of their next wonder drug. Though none of their drug therapies had ever proven to cure anything, psychiatrists continued their search for a magic bullet that they supposed would cure all. And in 1954, their dream, they believed, was realized with the introduction of psychiatry's first so-called miracle drug, chlorpromazine, better known as Thorazine. Originally designed and tested as a synthetic dye, then as an anti-parasitic in pigs, Thorazine was accidentally discovered to shut down human motor controls. One of the first papers promoting its psychiatric use stated, the aim is to produce a state of motor retardation, emotional indifference, and somnolence.
Thorazine was considered the chemical lobotomy. Instead of cutting off the frontal lobes of the brain with an ice pick, you didn't have to do that kind of surgery. You could do it with a drug.
Thorazine proved so lucrative in immobilizing patients exhibiting unwanted behavior that its maker, SmithKline & French, organized a major promotional campaign around the drug, including paying influential psychiatrists as speakers, organizing media campaigns, and even producing national television shows, a prelude to the mass drug marketing we see all around us today.
Thorazine at that time was thought of as a miracle because it was able to reduce the symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia at that time that they knew about it. It emptied all of the psychiatric housing units.
The campaign was wildly successful. SmithKline & French's income soared by over 500% in the following 2 decades, with Thorazine supplying over a third of the drug company's revenues in 1970. Eventually, an estimated 250 million people worldwide had been on Thorazine and drugs in its class, 23% more than the entire population of the United States. The floodgates had been opened. SKF and the psychiatrists on its payroll had proved that through marketing, there could be big money in psychiatric drugs. But it wasn't long before Thorazine was revealed to have problems of its own.
Thorazine chronically led to really serious problems such as tardive dyskinesia, which is a movement disorder that's very, very bothersome, and supposedly it's irreversible.
The tongue darting, the muscle jerking, the eyes rolling back in the head.
Most people were sometimes permanently damaged by it. So they were going to have to live their life with this neurological problem that was actually created by the pharmaceutical industry with their medication.
Because Thorazine so hindered mental functioning, its use had to be limited to institutions. But with big money at stake, the race was on to discover a psychiatric drug that could be taken out of the institutions and into the hands of a much wider, vaster, and more lucrative market, the general public.
Since they were emptying the institutions of all these psychotic patients with the advent of Thorazine, now they had to find different ways to treat people. So what better way than to go into the community and have an office and bring in your everyday person, or your executive under high stress, or mama who's taking care of all the kids, and they needed some way to create a therapy for them.
In 1955, that drug was approved. Its name was Miltown, the first of the so-called minor tranquilizers. But to sell their new class of psychiatric drugs to the public, psychiatrists and drug companies first had to reposition them as working on a disease process, rather than just as sedating or restraining agents for undesirable human behaviors, as Thorazine had been. To do this, they began a marketing blitz on their colleagues, placing print advertisements in professional publications, such as the American Journal of Psychiatry. Prominent psychiatrists were then hired to spread the word to the rest of the medical field. Few knew that Nathan Kline, one of the most influential psychiatrists of his time, was being paid by the drug industry when he proclaimed that tranquilizers such as Miltown were equal in importance to the introduction of atomic energy, if not more so. Free samples were shipped to psychiatrists and physicians to get patients started on the drug. A year later, the marketing rollout hit the public, and Miltown soon became the first blockbuster psychiatric drug, not just for those incarcerated in an insane asylum, but for the mainstream public. Miltown was marketed to pregnant women, stay-at-home moms, and busy white-collar office workers, who called it executive Excedrin.
So it opened up a door for community-based mental health, whereby the psychiatrist could then have a role. So they became very closely associated with the pharmaceutical industry. And they were demanding as well to come up with better things for mom and pop and the executive and the superstar Hollywood actress or actor. And soon, it became a fashion to take some of these medications.
By the 1960s, 36 million prescriptions for Milltown had been filled in the United States alone, accounting for $200 million in sales, an amount unheard of at that time for any psychiatric drug. Milltown's success led to the introduction of many more psychiatric drugs aimed at the general public throughout the 1950s and 60s. One such drug was Valium. Launched to the delirious acclaim of psychiatrists and the press, Valium was so widely prescribed to stressed-out housewives that it even acquired a nickname, Mother's Little Helper. Lost amidst this hoopla was strong and well-documented early evidence that tranquilizers also came with serious, life-changing side effects. Milltown, for example, was soon labeled by the 1962 President's Advisory Commission on Narcotic and Drug Abuse as more dangerous and addictive even than cocaine or methamphetamine, and fell quickly out of use. But the psychiatric community ignored these warnings. Pandora's box had been opened, and with their new pills, they were no longer caretakers of the insane. They were real doctors administering drugs to patients. And their backward logic was, if the drugs did indeed shut down mental symptoms, weren't they therefore addressing some physical disease in the brain? Within years, this reasoning enabled psychiatry to undergo a profound change. Psychiatrists were no longer caretakers, they were doctors. Mental complaints were no longer psychological, they were symptoms of disease. And to treat them, psychiatrists wrote them prescriptions.
It's all about money. The use of writing prescriptions and having an income from people coming in and getting their prescriptions and this, that, and the other is what revived the psychiatric community. It was the thing that put them back where they were earning money again.
Business was going so well that a group of prominent psychiatrists met in Puerto Rico in 1967 to lay out the expansion of psychotropic drug use for the year 2000. According to organizing psychiatrist Dr. Wayne O. Evans,
psychomedication is now an accepted way of life, and the search for the just right pill has become the goal for many people.
By the early 1980s, Valium had become the most widely prescribed drug of any kind in the Western world. In 1978 alone, nearly 2.3 billion tablets sold, enough to medicate 1/2 of the world population. The business of psychotropic drugging had gotten so out of hand that at a 1979 hearing on the use and abuse of benzodiazepines, one United States senator commented that
the whole pitch appears to be to sell, market, and sell and market.
But bigger things were yet to come.
The next drug that became a rage was Prozac. And of course, Prozac was not for anxiety, but for depression. And all of a sudden, the diagnosis of depression starts multiply. The number of people who are diagnosed as being depressed starts multiplying substantially.
Prozac was released amid great fanfare, with tales of miraculous recoveries, sick minds made well, and ruined lives restored. And all with almost no side effects or addiction, or so its manufacturer claimed. Many new antidepressants quickly followed, also pitching instant psychological relief with little downside. And with this, mainstream psychiatry abandoned psychotherapy for pharmacology forever. In a bold and effective marketing coup, the world was told that these new antidepressant drugs were not just for the depressed, but lifestyle drugs for a choose-your-mood society. But almost immediately, evidence emerged that claims of universal safety and effectiveness were far from the truth.
The adverse side effects of this class of drugs includes things like sexual dysfunction, agitation, facial involuntary movements of the face. Some of the psychiatrists in their books describe the tongue darting in and out of the mouth as an adverse side effect of SSRI drugs.
Within 10 years, staggering details of side effects such as violence and suicide could no longer be ignored, with an estimated 3.9 million adverse events on Prozac alone. Black box warnings alerting the public to significant risks of violence and suicide were issued, once again against loud protests from drug companies and organized psychiatry. But when the patents of antidepressants expired, just as predictably, psychiatrists and drug makers finally admitted the truth. But now they claimed here was a new scientific breakthrough that would change everything. A new class of drugs called the atypical antipsychotic, newly approved to treat both schizophrenia and a then obscure mental disorder dubbed bipolar disorder. Suddenly, the diagnosis of bipolar disorder became the rage, with diagnosis rates soaring by thousands of percentage points in a matter of years.
What is clear is that the patents run out, and the drug companies are always looking to maximize their profits, so they research new drugs, and they can keep them patented for about 17 years and charge monopoly prices. And then when the patent wears off, often the next one comes along.
Soon, however, atypical antipsychotics, like all their predecessors, were revealed as having crippling and even deadly side effects, such as obesity, diabetes, and even heart problems, along with questionable efficacy and almost certain dependency.
Pharmaceutical companies are trying to get away from the old style Thorazines and into the new antipsychotics, and we know that they're no better. So today's new and improved antipsychotic is no better than the old Thorazine, which was the miracle drug for psychiatry.
Today, the same cycle continues, with breathless news coverage of new chemical treatments promoted as breakthroughs. Even hallucinogens such as LSD and ecstasy are now being tested for future psychiatric prescription.
So you give them a label, and then because they've got a label, they get a certain class of drugs. In fact, if they get they'll get 2 or 3, but they're all out there. And if that doesn't work, we just change them slightly. We increase the dose, we change one drug for another within that class. If that doesn't work, we might add something else as a mood stabilizer, etc., etc. And so it goes. And there's this constant process of fiddling and chopping and changing.
And just when the public starts catching on to that the experts may be telling us a story, we move on to the next realm of drugs.
Psychiatry has become basically pharmaceutical management in America. That's what psychiatrists do. If you went to a surgeon, you would expect to get cut. If you go to psychiatrists, you expect to get medicated. That's what psychiatrists do.
A century and a half later, 2 questions remain. Where is the science that backs psychiatry up? And how long will the public continue to be fooled by false hopes, hype, and outright lies? Psychiatrists have long desired to be viewed on a par with medical professionals. But whereas regular physicians have diagnostic tests to prove or disprove illness, psychiatrists do not.
There is no objective testing in psychiatry. There is no blood test, there is no urine test, there is no biopsy. There's nothing that objectively proves that there's anything physiologically or biochemically wrong that's creating your symptoms.
With cancer, you can do a screening and it's there or not. You can look at the cells and you can tell if it's there. Different diseases, you can look at it and you can see it under a microscope, or you can see it in an MRI, or you can see it in a CAT scan. With mental health, you can't see it. You can't be diagnosed in a medical procedure. It's all subjective.
So the question becomes, without any scientific lab tests showing the presence or absence of mental problems, how does psychiatry's diagnostic system work? And how did it become so prevalent? Psychiatry's search for scientific grounding has been going on for well over a century. In the late 19th century, German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin was the first to attempt to classify mental problems as medical disease states. Though he devoted his life attempting to prove that these problems came exclusively from biological and hereditary sources, he never could, finally concluding it was nearly impossible to scientifically distinguish the normal from the insane. In spite of Kraepelin's findings, psychiatrists persisted, with many efforts at classification throughout the years, resulting in the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952. A small spiral-bound 130-page handbook, DSM-1 described 112 so-called mental disorders, based not on standard scientific procedure, but contributions from a write-in ballot mailed to 10% of the APA's member psychiatrists. With the release of its second edition in 1968, the DSM had now grown to 145 disorders. Still not based on any science, though packed with theories on the origins of its illnesses. But with the sudden surge in popularity of psychiatric drugs such as Miltown and Valium among the general public, the psychiatric community realized that a biological explanation to justify prescribing them had to be found. And they found it in a paper written by psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Schildkraut. Though he had no means of discovering what normal brain chemistry should consist of, Schildkraut theorized that mental problems might be caused by a biochemical imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain.
It's a great line, the chemical imbalance. There's no evidence for it. There is no way you can measure or document that such a thing occurs in the first place.
There are no lab tests to see what your neurotransmitter levels are or how much you need and how off your balance is.
Chemical imbalance sounds good, sounds scientific, but whereas, as we know, there isn't any way to measure what the balance is.
There is no identifiable chemical imbalance in the human brain other than the chemical imbalance that comes from putting a medication in that brain. And so we've been sold that there's a chemical imbalance, but there's no science to back that up.
Though Schildkraut was never able to prove his chemical imbalance theory, it was too late. The psychiatric community had already adopted the theory as a plausible-sounding medical explanation for the mental disorders listed in the DSM. But without a test confirming a chemical imbalance, psychiatrists were still bedeviled by a severe inconsistency of diagnosis. Not only that, but psychiatrists were often unable to tell the sane from the insane. This point was driven home in 1972 in the famous Rosenhan experiment, where a total of 8 perfectly healthy volunteers each presented themselves at a mental institution, claiming to hear voices in their head that only said the words empty, hollow, or thud. No other psychiatric symptoms were stated. The result, each of the volunteers, including Dr. David Rosenhan himself, was immediately committed into the institution.
The moment we were admitted to the hospital, we abandoned our symptom, and we behaved the way we usually behave. The question was, would anyone detect that we were sane? The answer was, no. No one ever did.
All but one was diagnosed as schizophrenic. They were only discharged after admitting they were indeed mentally ill and in remission. After learning of the experiment, the psychiatric community was furious. One hospital challenged Rosenhan to send in more volunteers, promising to catch every one of the fake patients. 3 months later, they proudly announced that of 193 patients presenting themselves, they had turned away over 41 who were pretending mental illness and considered another 42 suspect. The problem was, Dr. Rosenhan hadn't sent in a single person. 70 years later, Emil Kraepelin's conclusion that psychiatry could not distinguish sanity from insanity had once again been proven correct. In his study, Rosenhan concluded, any diagnostic process that lends itself too readily to massive errors of this sort cannot be a very reliable one. It wasn't just the embarrassment of the Rosenhan experiment that caused psychiatry's leadership to take a new approach to diagnosis. With the rapid expansion in the psychotropic drug business, psychiatry underwent a seismic shift in the way it promoted mental illness. And the third edition of the DSM, spearheaded by psychiatrist Dr. Robert Spitzer, took a decidedly brain-based biological approach. Unlike its predecessors, the proposed DSM-3 assumed that mental problems derived from physical abnormalities of the brain. And instead of describing possible psychological causes for mental distress, DSM-3 would simply provide clinicians with checklists of symptoms. However, these descriptions were broad enough to apply to anyone at any time of life. With no science to back them up, these newly proposed disorders and the checklists that went with them were subject to intense negotiation, compromise, alteration, and heated debate. Psychiatrist David Schaffer, who attended the DSM-3 conference, observed,
"People would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room, and whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression, is coming straight from England, was it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference."
Many committees are established to determine what should and shouldn't go into the DSM, the current revision. And a lot of the committee activity is based upon, could be personal bias, political pressure, the trend that may be in vogue then, and other things that are non-medical.
Well, in the DSM, I mean, they vote in diseases. I mean, they get together, the panel of psychiatrists look and decide, is this a disease or is this not a disease?
How many of you agree this should be a disease? They have a show of hands. They said 20 people in the room, 12 vote for it, 8 vote against it. Bingo. They have a disease. Tell me that that's science.
One psychologist reported that during discussions of the proposed criteria for masochistic personality disorder, Spitzer's wife protested about one symptom of the disorder, to which Spitzer responded, "Okay, take it out." Scientific or not, once a disorder is voted into the DSM, it is very hard to vote it out. On rare occasions, however, this too has occurred. Homosexuality, a mental illness according to DSM 1 and 2. After gay rights activists picketed their 1973 convention, the American Psychiatric Association buckled to political pressure and decided by a mail-in ballot of its member psychiatrists to remove it from DSM's next edition.
What happened? It wasn't like, there's some objective evidence that at one point it was a disease and we cured the disease and now it's a lifestyle choice. No, it was cultural. We became more liberal in this country and decided, okay, it's fine. Whereas, 50, 100 years ago, it wasn't fine, it was a problem. That's not medicine, that's something else.
And the psychiatrists who wrote the DSM-3 knew it, as Robert Spitzer would admit to the BBC many years later.
What happened is that we made estimates of prevalence of mental disorders totally descriptively, without considering that many of these conditions might be normal reactions, which are not really disorders. That's the problem.
But instead of learning from their mistakes, the American Psychiatric Association published the DSM-4 in 1994. And it was even bigger, with 374 different diagnoses amongst its 886 pages. The new edition more than tripled the number of mental illnesses listed in the DSM-1. This rapid expansion in the number of psychiatric diagnoses may not help the patient, but it benefits many others. Once a diagnosis has been created, it enters the professional curricula. Specialists emerge to treat it. Conferences are organized around it. Research and publications cover it. Psychiatrists formulate their patients' symptoms to correspond to it, and drugs are prescribed for it. The DSM, in short, was no longer a manual, but a full-fledged industry.
The DSM, although it is our Bible, it becomes the Bible and it becomes tantamount to, the tablet coming down from Mount Sinai, not just for psychiatry and psychology, but for insurance companies, for the legal profession. It comes into play as far as sentencing, It comes into play as far as custody decisions. So non-scientific information is used to make some radical, life-altering or life-ending decisions.
The danger of all these psychiatric diseases is that anyone walking the earth today could be labeled as having a mental illness. Using the DSM, psychiatrists at Harvard University have declared that half of everyone on earth will be mentally ill in their lifetime. One prominent Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. John Rady, goes a step further, arguing no one is truly normal. Though the American Psychiatric Association has quietly acknowledged the lack of evidence for Joseph Schildkraut's chemical imbalance theory, the claim is still flogged in the media and passed on to patients every day. And although you are not likely to hear it in the general media, psychiatrists readily admit that the disorders listed in the DSM have no proven pathology and therefore cannot be called medical diseases.
If you were to be confronted with someone saying that the DSM is not backed up by science, what do you have to say about that?
Oh, I would say that they're entirely right.
No, the DSM is not science.
I think there are non-scientific elements, political aspects of it that influence it. Yeah, absolutely.
DSM-4 is still far away from science.
The DSM system is far from perfect, but it's the best we have.
DSM stands for diagnosis as a source of money. It brings in a lot of money.
Today, psychiatric drugging rakes in over $80 billion a year for pharmaceutical companies. And with every new edition of the DSM, the diagnoses have not only expanded in number, but cast a wider net to encompass such population segments as senior citizens, the military, pregnant women, and even children.
In my training, when I first started this, they told us that they would not give a bipolar diagnosis for a child under 18. These days, I see children diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 5 and 6 years old.
A 2-year-old can be throwing a temper tantrum and then stop and be fine. Anybody that's a parent has seen that happen. That doesn't mean they're mentally ill. It means they're 2-year-olds.
How can you even diagnose a 2-year-old as a bipolar disorder? I mean, how can you diagnose anybody as a bipolar disorder if you want to look at it that way? Because there is no such thing as bipolar disorder, not from a medical standpoint. It's not like you can find a cell in a person that shows that they have bipolar disorder. It's not like they have a fever or run a temperature, like if they had a physical illness. This is a behavioral definition only. In other words, a human being sat there and made a subjective decision that this person has this so-called condition.
Today, nearly 1 million children are diagnosed as bipolar, making it more common than autism and diabetes combined. In 2007, 500,000 children and teenagers took at least one prescription for an antipsychotic, including 20,000 under the age of 6. Antipsychotic drugs, powerful chemicals designed originally for only the most seriously mentally troubled, are now a $22.8 billion industry.
If you spent days reading the newest DSM, you would be able to diagnose every human being that you ever saw. And with the diagnosis comes treatment.
The DSM most definitely helps in the prescribing of drugs. It legitimizes the process of pulling out the prescription pad, because here is this disease entity. The disease entity is addressed with this medication.
And the DSM is in the service of making things reductionist into very simple, simplistic ways of looking at things. That makes it easier for the pharmaceutical company to create a medication for. The only thing that we've left out of that equation is the person.
And the average person is completely unaware that psychiatric diagnoses are not medical, but merely voted on behaviors. Which leads us to our next question. How do psychiatrists take these invented disorders and get people to believe they have them? According to psychiatrists at the World Health Organization, 450 million people worldwide have a mental disorder. 3 times the metropolitan populations of Tokyo, New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris, Mexico City, Mumbai, Milano, Madrid, Toronto, Washington, Athens, Melbourne, Hong Kong, Singapore, Rome, and Berlin combined. Are there really this many mentally ill? Or is this just a case of good marketing? In early 1999, the United States was confronted with news of a frightening new disease epidemic. You blush, sweat, shake, even find it hard to breathe, posters read, with the tagline, "Imagine being allergic to people." The disease was social anxiety disorder, SAD, or SAD, and it was claimed to affect about 13.3% of the American population. And to find out more, readers were instructed to contact a group called the Social Anxiety Disorder Coalition. What the public was not told was that both the coalition and the campaign were created by a public relations agency and bankrolled by a drug company. Later that year, while the campaign was making millions of people aware of this previously unknown disease, the antidepressant Paxil became the first drug approved by the FDA for the treatment of social anxiety disorder. Psychiatrists such as Jack Gorman of Columbia University and Murray Stein of the University of California at San Diego signed up as psychiatric frontmen for Paxil's ad campaign. And within 3 years, Paxil shot from 3rd place in its drug class to 1st. Paxil's product director would later boast, "Every marketer's dream is to find an unidentified or unknown market and develop it." That's what we were able to do with social anxiety disorder. Paxil's competition took notice. That same year, Pfizer got FDA approval to sell its antidepressant, Zoloft, for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. They too hired a public relations firm to create their own psychiatric front group and paid psychiatrists to spread the word about the disorder. This campaign would claim that 1 person in 13 would develop PTSD over the course of a lifetime, and this included anyone witnessing a violent act, natural disaster, or distressing event. And as with Paxil, sales of Zoloft skyrocketed.
For the psychiatric drugs, the goal is to have as many people on them as possible. So the way to do that is to convince normal people that they have some defect or mental disease or condition that requires treatment. So I mean that's the way they do it. They hire these big marketing companies that come up with these campaigns.
We're going to tell you about your disease so that you can lead a happier, healthier life. Oh, and by the way, we have a drug too that helps to treat this disease.
This practice of selling sickness is known as disease mongering, a term defined by the late journalist Lynn Payer as trying to convince essentially well people that they are sick, or slightly sick people that they are very ill. On Madison Avenue, disease mongering is accomplished through a strategy known as condition branding, where mental illness is pitched just like cars, beer, or laundry detergent. And according to top New York branding guru Vince Parry, no therapeutic category is more accepting of condition branding than the field of anxiety and depression, where illness is rarely based on measurable physical symptoms and therefore open to conceptual definition. Parry then suggests to executives 3 principal strategies for what he called fostering the creation of psychiatric illness. The first is elevating the importance of a condition, or leading the public to believe that a minor or temporary mental problem is much worse and far more widespread than it really is. Prior to the introduction of SSRI antidepressants, depression was considered, even by psychiatrists, to affect only 100 people per million. Since then, estimates have been raised to as many as 100,000 cases per million, a 1,000-fold increase. The result is about 10% of Americans, some 27 million people, currently on antidepressants, twice as many as in 1996.
Very good marketing that all, expressions of human emotion, deep sadness and fear and anger and whatever else they happen to be, are now classified as, a major problem, a psychiatric problem, a psychological problem that needs to be dealt with drugs.
Another psychiatric illness, bipolar disorder, was also considered rare, affecting only 0.1% when it was first introduced in the DSM-3. Today, there are claims that as many as 10% of the population, 100 times the original number, have the condition. Pediatric bipolar disorder was not even listed in the DSM when Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Biederman began publishing studies claiming that mood swings in children were not normal behaviors, but in reality, mental illnesses. Biederman's disease-mongering campaign worked. In the last decade alone, the rate of children labeled with bipolar has soared 4,000%. But what parents were not told was that 25 different drug companies had underwritten Dr. Biederman's work. The extent of their influence was not revealed until a 2008 Senate investigation exposed Dr. Biederman for failing to report more than $1.6 million in pharmaceutical income. But these revelations had no effect on psychiatry. Pediatric bipolar continues to be widely accepted in the psychiatric community.
These labels are being applied to younger and younger children, which I think is really, a sad case. Not sure I agree with any of those labels to begin with, but let alone for them to be applied universally to young kids.
This idea that childhood itself is a psychiatric disease is simply based off some completely unsubstantiated idea that got printed in the psychiatric manual, and there's no science behind it whatsoever.
Disease-mongering strategy number 2, redefining an existing condition. This tactic takes an ordinary state of mind and recasts it as a psychiatric disease that now must be treated with drugs. Case in point, the winter blues, a common mental condition related to the lack of sunlight during winter months, but redefined by psychiatrists as seasonal affective disorder, a psychiatric disease requiring psychiatric treatment. As another example, consider the changing emotions during a woman's menstruation, made over by psychiatrists as premenstrual dysphoric disorder, a mental illness discovered not in a laboratory, but in the marketing department of drug maker Eli Lilly.
When Prozac patent came up, they realized they needed to come up with some sort of new to keep the money rolling in, and they came up with a new disorder. They just made it out of thin air, the premenstrual dysphoric disorder, the PMDD, and then the new wonder drug, which was Serafem, which if you look at Serafem on the back of the label, it just says, this is Prozac. And they were able to keep that patent so that nobody else could make it, so that they could keep that money rolling in.
Many of the drugs today are simply drugs repackaged. They're drugs that had a patent and now are generic, or now get called something else, or they decide now to use them for something else.
Disease-mongering strategy number 3, creating a new condition for an unmet market need. Example, compulsive shopping disorder, publicized by psychiatrist Dr. Jack Gorman. In Gorman's public appearances, a recent study was cited that claimed that as many as 20 million Americans, 90% of them women, could have the problem. What he did not reveal was that the study was funded by Forest Laboratories, maker of the antidepressant Celexa, and that he was a paid consultant to at least 13 pharmaceutical firms, Forest included. Most consumers have never heard of the concept of marketing of disease for profit, but to those in the advertising and drug industries, it is well known. A 2005 Reuters Business Insight report, written for drug company executives, notes that the ability to create new disease markets is bringing untold billions in soaring drug sales, and that the coming years will bear greater witness to the corporate-sponsored creation of disease.
A kid wets the bed, you can bill on that. They're going to have one called a skin picking disorder. You pick your skin, you can diagnose and bill on that. You can always find a diagnosis.
One might then ask, is anyone questioning this rampant increase in extremely questionable and scientifically unproven mental diagnoses? In April 2006, the British Medical Journal inadvertently found out when they published a groundbreaking study announcing a newly discovered psychiatric disease, motivational deficiency disorder, or MODED. Characterized by lethargy and an unwillingness to work, MODED was claimed to affect millions, But when media outlets around the world uncritically broadcast the news, the journal told the truth. The study was part of their April Fool's Day edition. But the joke made its point. Disease mongering works. Even people without any mental illness at all can be deemed at risk and recommended drug treatment. One study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association urged all stroke victims to take an antidepressant to prevent depression, whether they were depressed or not. It was later discovered that its authors had an undisclosed financial relationship with the maker of the antidepressant Lexapro. Preventive drugging is the wave of the future. As one expert noted, there is an apparently limitless amount of money to be made from marketing pharmaceutical remedies for diseases, and even more from remedies to reduce risk factors for disease.
And of course, every time they come out with a new mental disorder, then they come out with a new drug to counteract it. At least to me, it seems like nothing more than a marketing ploy.
There are certain executives in the pharmaceutical manufacturers that have stated that one day in America, every person will be on drugs, healthy or not.
With these clever disease-mongering campaigns, 100 million people worldwide are currently on psychotropic drugs. And as a result, the psychotropic drug industry is grossing over $150,000 every minute. Observed one consumer advocate, you can sell hundreds of millions of dollars worth of a drug, even a bad drug, if you have the right marketing campaign. Which leads us to our next question. Now that disease-mongering campaigns are creating the illusion of widespread mental illness, how safe are the drugs psychiatrists are prescribing to treat it? In modern psychiatry, psychotropic drugs have become the weapons of choice. But are they as safe as we've been led to believe? International regulatory bodies, such as the United States Food and Drug Administration, require that all drugs be proven safe and effective before they can be released. To accomplish this, pharmaceutical companies must conduct thorough and exacting clinical trials that prove the safety and efficacy of their drugs prior to marketing. At least, that's what's supposed to happen. But underneath the public relations veneer, claims of psychotropic drug safety by psychiatrists and drug companies are far from the truth. And there are many reasons why. To begin with, drug safety testing is predominantly done by drug companies, not by governmental agencies or independent laboratories, creating an obvious conflict of interest.
They pay for it, they bring in the researchers, they have every opportunity to skew the research, to manipulate it, to produce exactly what they want it to produce.
The first step in submitting an application for a psychotropic drug is to find a disorder in psychiatry's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and attach it to the drug. Then clinical trials begin, first on animals, then on humans. If the drug makes it to human testing, clinical trials then follow 4 phases. In phase 1, it is tested on a very small number of volunteers, usually healthy young subjects, to determine if the drug is not overly toxic and what side effects it carries.
And the studies that are done have young men or women that have very little body fat and are healthy in their 20s. They don't test these drugs on elderly people that have a huge amount of body fat or different proportion of body fat, and they hold the reaction of their drugs is totally different, but they don't ever consider that.
In phase 2, psychiatric researchers determine if the drug creates the sought-after effects on the human body and how large a dose can be given before drug toxicity sets in.
So just the people that I already know are going to perform well on my drug are going to be entered in this trial. Well, how well do you think your drug's going to come out?
Phase 3 testing compares the psychotropic drug against a placebo or sugar pill. Although phase 3 testing is larger and more extensive than phases 1 or 2, it normally involves only about 1,000 patients and lasts a mere 4 to 8 weeks, certainly not enough time to determine any long-term side effects. Today, clinical research is a profit-driven multinational industry where drug companies and psychiatric researchers are involved in every detail, from study design to data analysis to study publication. But in doing their trials, psychiatrists face a problem the rest of the medical field does not. They have no scientific lab tests to objectively measure improvement.
On a clinical trial for, say, a drug for cancer or for high cholesterol, it's easy to see if something is working because you can look at the study result. The cholesterol level is dropped, or the cancer is shrunk, or the cancer cells are going away, or there are less of them. You can physically see the answer. With mental health issues, you don't have that luxury.
It is this lack of science that permits psychiatric drug researchers many opportunities to skew results of drug trials in the pharmaceutical company's favor.
One of the ones I think that is most important is the placebo washout. And what that is basically that they give people a placebo pill, the sugar pill, and then anybody who says that they feel better, they get rid of them. And so in which case, they already skew the sample of people being included into the study. That's going to stack the cards against the placebo, and it's going to show an artificial greater effect for the drug.
The data shows that the people that got placebo did better. And you know what the researchers said? Oh, that's the placebo effect. We want to get those people out of the study.
Another trick of the trade involves giving subjects the test drugs prior to the trial and then putting them in withdrawal. Then, after starting the trial, they are put back on the test drug and will either come out of withdrawal and score better, or, if on a placebo, will continue to feel worse. Psychiatrist Richard Borison, for example, took schizophrenics off Haldol to generate active psychosis, then put them back on Haldol during the trial. In spite of this, his study is still cited in psychiatric literature.
Another way that they can manipulate the data is unweighted distributions. I have 3 studies that I look at. One study has 1,000 people in it, and another one has 10 people in it, and another one has 15 people in it. The 1,000-person study showed that the drug was no benefit at all. But the 2 other studies that only had 10 and 15 people in it showed the drugs were incredibly superior. So what do they say? They say 2 out of 3 studies showed greater benefit to the drug group.
Perhaps the most common way of tilting the outcome of a clinical trial is simply not to count the individuals dropping out of the study because of the side effects. In fact, in clinical trials for the antipsychotic Zyprexa, 2/3 of the 2,500 participants had so many side effects they dropped out. Of the remaining 800, 22% reported serious adverse reactions to the drug. And during the Prozac approval trials, of the 11,000 patients tested, only 286, less than 3%, actually completed the short 4 to 6 week trials. In another common practice, adverse side effects are covered up by giving additional drugs that are not part of the study. And some researchers have been known to simply falsify the studies. Case in point, psychiatrist Farouk Abuzahab, former ethics committee chair of the Minnesota Psychiatry Society, whose patient he recruited into one of his clinical trials, reported having extreme thoughts of suicide. In his research documents, however, he noted 0 adverse events. 2 days later, she jumped from a Minneapolis bridge to her death. A final way of skewing test data is to hide unwanted drug reactions under less frightening terms. This trick was used in the notorious Paxil Study 329, where such side effects as aggressive events, homicidal thoughts, and homicidal acts were categorized under the word hostility, while under the nebulous term emotional lability were filed suicidal thoughts and actions. In many cases, clinical trials are set up not to look for violence and suicide at all.
It is a problem that if these clinical trials don't specifically really ask a lot of questions about the nature of suicidal ideation and how the person feels and hopelessness and akathisia, if they don't ask those questions very specifically, they're not going to really get that data, and it's not going to come up.
Designing biased trials to avoid negative findings, interpreting the raw data to favor your drug, and spinning the entire study to accentuate the positive are just some of the many, many ways to bias a trial. It is this perfect storm of intellectual dishonesty that has led one drug expert to conclude that it can be proven that most claimed research findings are false. But it is the drug companies that own the studies, and when they believe they have compiled enough evidence to convince regulators that their drug is safe and effective, they submit their phase 3 clinical trials for approval. The FDA only requires that 2 clinical trials be submitted, so drug companies can conduct as many studies as it takes to find the 2 that have the best chance at FDA approval.
You only need 2 positive trials against placebo, and it doesn't matter if you did 1,000, as long as you get 2. And it's amazing, sometimes they actually don't. They might pool data from another couple of clinical trials in order to get that approved.
They don't need to report all their data. They don't need to report all the trials that they do. They only need to report the ones that they want. They can handpick whichever one they want and then submit just those couple to the FDA.
As FDA Director of the Division of Neuropharmacological Drug Products, psychiatrist Paul Lieber complained, the sponsor could just do studies until the cows come home, until he gets 2 of them that are statistically significant by chance alone, walks them out, and says he had met the criteria.
The New England Journal published a study about a year ago showing that many clinical trials that had been conducted and registered with the Food and Drug Administration were never published because they came out showing no significant advantage over placebo. So antidepressants are not as effective as they are being made out to be, and the side effects are not as emphasized as much as they should be.
This point was driven home in 2008 by psychologist Irving Kirsch and his colleagues, who obtained every clinical trial ever submitted, published and unpublished, from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration of 4 new-generation antidepressants. The results were both alarming and enlightening. In Kirsch's words, antidepressant medications have reported only modest benefits over placebo treatment. And when unpublished trial data are included, the benefit falls below accepted criteria for clinical significance. In addition to this, volumes of effects associated with these antidepressants have since been discovered, including homicide, suicide, and mass murder.
People really don't realize that from the beginning there's been a question of how marginally efficacious these drugs really are apart from placebo.
And yet we have horrific side effects. Combine the 2, and where's your risk to benefit ratio? It's down the toilet.
But psychiatrists dismissed Kirsch's study because psychotropic drugs are big business, and clinical trials are a big part of that business. Take, for example, Martin Keller, former chair of the psychiatry department at Brown University, lead author of the so-called Paxil 329 study. This clinical trial, which tested hundreds of children on the antidepressant Paxil, found that the drug was generally well tolerated and effective, which in scientific terms is glowing praise. And the study's list of co-authors, 22 of the most prominent key opinion leaders in psychiatry.
I mean, that was a lot of people, but they were the who's who of psychiatry, and this was going to be a publication that I think, took them, into the end zone on getting their approval for kids.
With the FDA's blessing, Paxil became a blockbuster in the child and adolescent market, with sales of $55 million in 2002. It wasn't until the New York State Attorney General's office sued in 2004 that the truth finally came out. The raw data showed that not only was Paxil no more effective than placebo, but the young patients on Paxil were 6 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts. In fact, this data also revealed that 11 of the 93 children on the study developed serious side effects, of whom 7 had to be hospitalized. But according to Keller's own administrator, many of those children were either dropped from the study or coded as non-compliant to avoid having to be counted. While admitting no guilt, the drug companies settled out of court for $2.5 million, less money than Paxil was grossing every 7 hours. Hundreds of civil suits followed, but when Dr. Keller, as lead author of the Paxil 329 study, was deposed by attorneys, he would not admit to much.
I can't remember exactly what I said. I don't remember anything specific about any of these meetings. If my name wasn't on the top, I wouldn't remember ever having seen it. If I saw them, I don't remember. The answer is, I don't remember. I don't recall if I was. I don't recall asking him, which isn't to say that I didn't.
I want to pick up on the question Mr. Coffin asked you about the 5-fold increase of the Paxil kids experiencing suicidality over the placebo kids. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
And you said that you weren't particularly aware of that except for with regard to a manuscript that was sent to you in confidence by GSK?
Correct.
That actually is not correct, though. I mean, this was an issue that had been presented to you by a number of different reporters that you personally responded to. Is that correct?
I don't remember.
How could Dr. Keller have known so little about the drug study of which he was lead author, and which he himself used to promote Paxil for children in prominent medical journals and conferences?
The ultimate publication of Study 329 was ghostwritten by an agency hired by GlaxoSmithKline, and eventually they, after the manuscript was written, they put Martin Keller's name on it as an author.
You know, there again, and maybe you can tell me where I can find it in the paper.
No, I'm asking you if you were aware.
I don't remember the specifics.
And then we finally showed him a document from GlaxoSmithKline where GlaxoSmithKline says that the study was entirely flawed. It was a complete failed study, and it certainly didn't show that Paxil was remarkably efficacious for treating children and adolescents in depression.
Can you read that into the record, please?
Essentially, the study did not really show Paxil was effective in treating adolescent depression, which is not something we want to publicize.
We asked him, with that information now, how can you tell us that it would be okay and safe to give a kid Paxil? And he couldn't answer the question. He sat back, he put his head in his hands, and for, the longest 2 minutes sat there silent.
During the last 2 years of his Paxil study, Keller personally pocketed $1 million in drug company money, none of which he disclosed in his published research.
When people look at the field of psychiatry and they hear all these reports in the New York Times and Boston Globe, and they see this psychiatrist or this psychologist, took money and didn't disclose it, they wonder, well, is this causing a biases, in the field? I think that's a legitimate concern of the public because of the fact that it is true.
They are unaware that FDA approval does not guarantee drug safety, and that the clinical trials justifying that approval are frequently based on falsities and deceptions. But once the drug is approved, the next challenge is, how could they reach their target demographic, the end user, and drive them into doctors' offices to demand these drugs? In the mid-1970s, Henry Gadsden, head of Merck, one of the world's largest drug corporations, told Fortune magazine that he wanted his company to be more like chewing gum maker Wrigley's and sell to everyone, even healthy people. Has Gadsden's dream come true? Is marketing now driving the machinery of one of the most profitable industries on Earth? Are psychotropic drugs really being marketed like chewing gum? Psychotropic drugs are marketed on two fronts. The first is through sales campaigns aimed at doctors, psychiatrists, and other prescribers. And on a second flank, the drugs are promoted heavily to consumers, you. Until recently, however, it was rare to see a drug advertisement on television because, by law, drug companies had to list all side effects, a list far too long for a 30 or 60-second spot. But in 1997, drug company lobbyists pressured the U.S. Congress to relax this rule and allow them to mention only some of the side effects. With this simple change, advertising psychotropic drugs on American television suddenly became possible. And this opened the floodgates to a torrent of advertising, which soared from $595 million a year in 1996 to $4.7 billion today, an increase of almost 700%.
The direct-to-consumer advertising on television, they don't give that message that in order to be healthy, you need to be off drugs. They don't give you that message. They give you the message that, oh, you have a problem, you have an issue, here's a drug that'll fix you.
And a lot of money is driving this message home. The average American television viewer now sees as many as 16 hours of drug advertising a year.
The pharmaceutical industry reaches right into our living room on a daily basis and tries to convince us that we have this problem that they can solve with a pill. That's dangerous.
If you watch any primetime TV, if you watch any primetime news, you're going to get multiple advertisements for whatever the current med is of choice.
On television, there are ads now that say, you have got this condition and you're feeling miserable. Ask your doctor to give you this pill. Take this pill, it's over the counter. We're being taught, our society really pushes the idea of quick, simple answers.
Ask your doctor if Abilify is right for you.
Ask your doctor about Cymbalta.
Talk to your doctor about Zoloft.
Ask your doctor about Prestige.
Ask your doctor if it's
Talk to your doctor about the risks and benefits of adding Abilify.
If you can convince somebody that they've got a medical or biological problem, that the only thing that solves it is a pill, stands to reason you're going to sell more pills.
To see how effective this Ask Your Doctor marketing strategy is, one study sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health in 2005 sent trained actors in to doctors and psychiatrists' offices, claiming to be depressed and asking for a specific antidepressant. 50% of them received a prescription for the very drug they requested. And even if the actor did not ask for any psychotropic drug at all, he was given a prescription a third of the time.
The doctors feel tremendously pressured to please the patient, to prescribe what the patient is asking for. Nobody likes being labeled as the doc who didn't do anything for me.
The doctor is a businessman, and he knows that if he doesn't fulfill that patient's request, there's a probability that that patient will go elsewhere because he'll find somebody that's willing to prescribe that drug.
It should be the doctor's choice. It should be the doctor's evaluation driving the use of any medication. It shouldn't be giving a patient the opportunity to see something on TV and come in and ask for it by name, because doctors then are immediately put in a situation where they feel pressured to pull out the prescription pad, whereas they should have come to that conclusion based on their actual clinical data.
But getting the patient to walk in and demand psychotropic drugs for non-existent diseases has taken that power out of doctors' hands. And this has been done through psychiatric drug marketing campaigns that fill the coffers of media outlets. Drug advertising on television, for example, accounts for 55% of the pharmaceutical industry's direct-to-consumer advertising budget. And estimates show that if this television advertising were ever banned, prescription sales in the United States alone would plummet by $10 billion. Magazines and other print media also depend on pharmaceutical companies for much of their advertising dollars, over $1.8 billion a year. But is this a good thing? Do such massive amounts of ad revenue taint what we see in the media?
You know, obviously the advertising pays for the television programs. So the real money is in the advertising, not in the television program.
So that's where the money is. I don't know of too many magazines that want to run huge advertisements blasting the drug companies that are paying for the magazine on the next page. They're going to take a lot of heat, and people are going to pull their ads if they start doing that. So again, you have a huge conflict of interest at play with the mass media.
This partnership between the pharmaceutical industry and the media also extends to public service announcements promoting psychiatric disease.
2 million Americans living with schizophrenia.
Kids with ADHD or you have postpartum depression. Still dealing with depression? It could be your time for change.
Psychiatrists are featured promoting drugs in video news releases, which look just like TV news reports, but are, in reality, drug company-produced marketing spots. On news interviews, the experts furnished come from approved drug company speakers bureaus, and these psychiatrists rarely disclose their financial ties. As a result, mental health care segments in the media rarely deviate from the psychiatric party line. Psychotropic drugs are mentioned in movies and television, such as Prozac on the TV series The Sopranos, and Zoloft, a product placement in the film The Sixth Sense. This mountain of marketing is not confined to broadcast media only. Print, too, is inundated with drug propaganda, masquerading as news and information.
All you have to do is look at any accepted magazine in America today, whether it be on even a women's journal or men's journal. There's always some type of pharmaceutical product that's being focused. And they've gone so far as to give away free samples. All you have to do is write in this coupon.
And the psychiatric drug message has even infiltrated the taxpayer-supported public radio. For instance, psychiatrist Frederick Goodwin hosted a talk show for years where he championed the use of psychotropic drugs. As we'll be hearing today, Dr. Goodwin assured his listeners, modern treatments, mood stabilizers in particular, have been proven both safe and effective in bipolar children. What he did not say was that he would be paid $2,500 by pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline to give a lecture that very night promoting their mood stabilizer drug, Lamictal. And there was more. The very week that Dr. Goodwin told radio audiences that there is no credible scientific evidence linking antidepressants to violence or to suicide, he raked in $20,000 from Glaxo, which had already admitted that it had suppressed studies revealing that its antidepressant Paxil increased the risk of suicide. Further investigation revealed that Goodwin had failed to report more than $1.3 million in drug company income. Might this level of conflict of interest be preventing the mainstream media from revealing the full truth about psychiatric drugs?
As long as we have direct-to-consumer advertising and the marketing dollars the pharmaceutical companies put into it, you will not hear a companion story or any information about a school shooter or a person who went to their work and killed all their family members and friends. You will never hear whether or not they were on a medication. What you will hear is how depressed they were. And you'll have consultant after consultant and psychiatrist after psychiatrist coming up and being interviewed to discuss how mentally screwed up this person was and how they weren't doing their treatment the way they were supposed to, or they didn't seek treatment when they should have.
This story has protected psychiatrists and their drugs for decades. To understand why one hears it so often, one need look no further than the bottom line. As parts of large corporate giants, today's media companies are in the business of making money. And to their CEOs, keeping stock prices high is part of their job description. And when pharmaceutical advertising money is your lifeblood, there is little chance you will rock the boat. With traditional sources so compromised, one might wonder if the information they're getting on psychotropic drugs really is the whole story. But what about the internet? Well, psychiatrists and drug companies are already pushing psychotropic drugs in cyberspace too, with very few restrictions.
If a patient goes online and looks up a drug and puts in a drug's name, and there'll be a bunch of sites that come up, many of those sites will be funded by the drug companies, but you won't be able to tell from the site. You'd have to, dig up, if at all. You may have no idea that that site was funded at all by the drug company. And especially those ones like Ask a Doctor, those are definitely drug company driven.
Through every communication outlet they can influence, psychiatrists and drug companies team up to drum out one single relentless message. You are sick. We've got the answer. And ask your doctor. So their next strategy is How do you convince even more people to take psychotropic drugs, all the while remaining a hidden influence? Psychiatrists insist that a mental health screening would be beneficial for everyone. But is this true? And what are the risks? In 2003, a presidential advisory group known as the New Freedom Commission on Mental Health issued a comprehensive program that laid out its strategy for screening major segments of American society for signs of mental illness. Some of their goals included programs creating early detection of mental illness, enlarging the role of schools in diagnosing and treating mental problems, and expanding the use of mental health screening beyond the psychiatrist's couch and into the offices of primary care physicians.
It's going to screen the population for mental health, the whole population. They're going to do it by stages, starting with school children, of course.
So far, mandatory mental health screening is not yet a reality, except for a few small segments of society. One of them consists of the most powerless and disenfranchised of them all, foster children.
A child goes into foster care, they label the child with some kind of a psychological problem. The child is immediately sent to therapy. Well, the therapist will say, well, I believe the child needs to be on something. So they recommend that the child see a psychiatrist to have the drug administered.
Out of the 60, 65 families that I see, easily 90% of the kids they have the mental health diagnosis to begin with. If they get it from a psychiatrist, it almost always comes with meds. And I think that we see identified as at-risk kids in the community, and we see some of the most intense situations, and a lot of them are on 4 or 5 different meds.
I've seen children that when the day they're taken out of their parents' custody and placed into state custody, actually seem happy, healthy, vibrant, energetic. And then, 2 months later, after they began taking these medications, they are very slow. They are zombie-like, is the best way to describe it.
Today, all children entering Texas's foster care system receive mental health screening. The result? 60% of the state's foster child population is diagnosed and put on at least one psychotropic drug, including some children as young as 3 years old. And it is worse in other states. In Massachusetts, for example, 2/3 of children in state care are being treated for mental illness. Nationally, foster children are being drugged at over triple the rate of children in the general population, such as in the case of 7-year-old foster child Gabriel Myers, on 2 powerful psychotropic drugs, one carrying an FDA warning for causing suicidal thoughts in children when he hanged himself with a shower hose. Another market segment is active duty soldiers, who are routinely screened at military clinics, labeled with a mental disorder, and given powerful and potentially violence-inducing drugs.
Iraq wasn't like Vietnam. There weren't illegal drugs everywhere. But there were drugs everywhere because, every guy on post, they knew all they needed to do was go down and see the combat stress unit, the shrink, and he was the drug dealer on post for us.
Almost everybody that saw the body or experienced the event were put on some sort of psychotropic medication. Some
bases where my friends were at, my fellow veterans were at, everyone, the whole platoon was on drugs.
I would say about 75% of active duty military is addicted to some type of psychotropic drug.
You could walk around a military barracks and you ask someone for some Prozac, and somebody's got some Prozac or some Xanax or some Zoloft.
I've got friends who were in the Army with me who are now dependent on Zoloft and psychotropic drugs just because they got used to it in Iraq and they didn't ever want to get off it, and now they're dependent on it and addicted to it.
We have huge numbers of military people on antidepressants. And instead of the suicide rate going down, which you'd expect if the drugs were effective, the suicide rate is going up.
This last January, we had more soldiers commit suicide than we had die in combat. And what's not being brought out much yet is the fact that the large majority of these soldiers were on these drugs. We're drugging the military at a rate we've never, ever seen before.
And this is just the beginning. Military mental health screening programs are planned for 43 clinics in 15 bases throughout the United States, Germany, and Italy. Studies reveal that as many as 12% of those serving in Iraq and 17% in Afghanistan are on some type of antidepressant or sleeping pill. A total of 20,000 service members. But this number pales in comparison to the number of pregnant or postnatal women that could be drugged should mandatory psychiatric screening laws for them come to pass. Even without laws mandating it, expectant mothers may be screened for mental illness and not even know it. Here are some women interviewed coming out of their doctor's offices.
Have you ever been screened for mental illness?
I have not been screened for mental illness.
I know I've never been screened for any mental illness.
I don't remember any pre-screening. I have not been.
No.
No? Have you ever been screened for any mental illness?
No, I have not been screened for any mental illness.
Did your OB/GYN or gynecologist have you fill out a questionnaire that contains psychological questions?
Yes, my OB/GYN did give me a questionnaire that has psychological questions.
I've never been screened for mental illness. Yes, I would say the first time I went to see my OB/GYN, I did fill out questionnaires about even family medical history, my mental state.
I've not been screened for any mental illness or depression. I took a questionnaire in my 6-week checkup, and it basically asked me about if I was crying, if I felt depressed.
Yeah, it was a questionnaire about depression. If you're depressed, or if you had any history of depression.
Are you happy with your normal day? Are you happy about being pregnant?
Have you ever hurt yourself? Are you happy? If I feel like hurting someone, if I was angry.
Do mental illness run in your family?
You know, it was very noticeable to me after the pregnancy that they're actually fishing for the postpartum depression.
When I was pregnant with my daughter, before I had her, I had to take postpartum depression medicine from my 7th month on to my 9th month.
And where is this screening leading? To programs like a little-known drugging scheme originally formulated in Texas in 1995 called the Texas Medication Algorithm Project, or TMAP.
TMAP is a program that was originated starting in the 90s, a collaborative group of doctors from University of Texas and the Texas Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation. And what it was supposed to do was come up with the best practice for treating mental illness.
Using research funding from 11 different pharmaceutical companies, this panel, dominated by psychiatrists, created a step-by-step flowchart that requires the prescribing of only the latest and most expensive psychiatric drugs for patients with mental problems. And if one psychotropic didn't work, doctors were obligated to try another expensive one. And if none worked, the next step would be electric shock treatment. But those running TMAP were hiding a major conflict of interest.
They didn't disclose that the researchers that were all involved in creating this, almost every single one of them had financial relationships with the pharmaceutical companies.
But Texas isn't the only state with problems of corruption. Alan Jones was an investigator in the office of the Pennsylvania Inspector General.
I learned that these monies were all coming in to the state to support and to promote a program called TMAP, the Texas Medication Algorithm Project. And so my concern was piqued very quickly that there was at least one state official who might be inappropriately receiving and dispersing monies from drug companies. They called it PenMap, but it was based entirely on the TMAP model. Also very quickly, I learned that there were other state employees who were serving on advisory boards financed through various pharmaceutical companies, and other state employees who were accepting honorariums personally, directly, from drug companies for speaking in their state capacities or official capacities. That's a felony in Pennsylvania. I saw there was a much bigger picture and attempted to surface that bigger picture and was consistently told to back off. I was told that drug companies write checks to politicians on both sides of the aisle. Back off. You will not expand this investigation into the drug companies. continued to press the investigation, much of it on my own time at this point. I became increasingly alarmed that all of the drugs recommended by the TMAP program were exclusively the new patented atypical antipsychotics for schizophrenia and all of the brand new patented SSRI antidepressants. None of it added up. When it became obvious to me that my investigation was not going to be permitted to continue, and it became obvious to the Inspector General's office that I was not going to stop, I was removed from lead investigator on the case. They threatened me with loss of career, with loss of job, with loss of reputation, essentially.
Despite the investigation resulting in the conviction of Pennsylvania's chief pharmacist, TMAP and offshoots like PenMap spread throughout the country, generating billions of dollars in drug sales. But the psychiatric gravy train comes at great public cost. In 2001, TMAP and its children's equivalent CMAP bankrupted the Texas Medicaid program and the state's mental health and prison systems. So, what do we see in the final picture? A government-run, taxpayer-funded mental health screening program wherein every person judged by psychiatrists to have a mental illness is given powerful, dangerous, and expensive psychotropic drugs, and if they don't work, electroshock treatment.
They're going to start with school children on the New Freedom Initiative, then they're going to move it to senior citizen nursing homes, then they're going to move it to, of course, military, and then parents.
By the time you're 18, you've been screened in utero when you were an infant. You were screened as an infant when you first came out. You were screened in your daycare. You were screened then at school. You were screened at the pediatrician's office. You're screened in high school. You're screened over and over again.
And to sit there and pass laws requiring that people be screened and drugged based on screening under state law or federal law is really, it's criminal. It should not be done.
They're marketing this madness all over this country, and we are actually becoming an example for the rest of the world. So we're, again, the poster child, if you will, and so the rest of the world is spending more and more on drugs.
I don't know that there was ever a time in the history of the world where people have been drugged to the extent of what we're seeing today.
The reality is, if you look at the overall picture, I don't see these drugs helping us make a better society. We see it in the military, we see it in our children, we see it in the schools. These drugs are not working to make a better society.
And with hidden mental illness marketing campaigns at full tilt, what happens to patients once diagnosed and delivered into the psychotropic drugging machine? If drugs are being sold as safe and effective by psychiatrists and drug companies, why is it that we are seeing an alarming increase in consumer-reported adverse side effects? What are psychiatrists not telling us? All drugs create biological changes in the human body. In mainstream medicine, those changes that are intended are called main effects. Those that aren't are called side effects. No drug is without effects, side or otherwise. But with psychiatric drugs targeting delicate brain processes, all effects, even main effects, can be hazardous, unpredictable, and sometimes irreversible.
All these medications that are apparently supposed to act as a magic pill, they're finding all of them have side effects that, could put the patient in harm's way just as well as it could help them.
So, just what are these drugs doing? And how do they work? To find out, you should be able to locate much of this information in the drug's package insert, or PI. Contained in this insert is the mechanism of action, the drug maker's explanation for how the drug works on the body. Take, for example, antibiotics. drugs used for over 50 years as a cure for infectious diseases such as tetanus, tuberculosis, and strep throat. Its mechanism of action is well known. Antibiotics prevent the cellular activity of bacteria, thus inhibiting its growth or killing it altogether. But with psychotropics, drug makers say on their own package insert that their mechanism of action is unknown.
Most of the medications that are given to clients, whether they're SSRI medications or they're antipsychotics, a lot of the pharmacology of these medications, they don't even know how they work in the first place.
But it has been noted that there is one primary side effect of psychotropics that is common to all.
Most medication and psychotropic medication, I've noticed, tends to flatten the things, so that while you're decreasing the depression, you're also decreasing the joy. And so you're minimizing what it means to be human in the service of avoiding dealing with a problem.
They can't connect to the world around them. They feel like there's no feeling, which is, you should have some feeling there.
All that's doing is really numbing them down, and they're not doing the work that they need to do to resolve that issue that's going on somewhere internally.
But the numbing of emotions is not the only way psychotropic drugs affect the user.
They change your body's makeup, you change your body how it reacts to things. And so even though people, their psychological state, they may be over their depression, they physically will need that drug still. And so that becomes the complication of getting them off.
I have people come to me on a weekend, they run out of refills, and they say to me, if I don't take this drug, I'm gonna get sick. If I don't take this drug, I'm gonna get sick. We don't talk about psychologically, we don't talk about depression, we don't talk about anxiety. I am going to get sick if I don't take this drug this weekend. It has nothing to do with psychology.
But listen to what some psychiatrists questioned at a recent APA conference had to say about addiction.
How addictive are psychiatric drugs?
They aren't. Only benzodiazepines.
They're not addictive at all.
Antidepressants are not generally considered addictive.
SSRIs are not addictive.
Antipsychotics, they don't cause addiction.
Major tranquilizers are all safe as far as addiction is concerned.
The drugs that most of us are using in neuropsychiatry are not addictive at all.
So who's right? To find out, we need look no further than former patients with first-hand experience.
The psychologists and psychiatrists, I went to both. They never told me that they would be addictive, they would cause me to have these thoughts.
For sure, the psychiatric drugs I was on was addicting.
Within six months to 9 months, I was hooked.
Boy, Xanax had a hold of me. I mean, I was going through a bottle of pills every 3 or 4 days.
The reality is that it is addicting. It will wreck a person's life.
This conflict on addiction all comes down to a definition of words. Most people think of addiction as an uncontrollable psychological or physical need for a certain substance. But not psychiatrists. They define addiction as the craving of a higher and higher dose of the same drug, while the uncontrollable need to keep taking a drug is categorized only as dependence. This is why psychiatrists will not admit that their drugs are addictive.
Some of the psych medicines, particularly the benzodiazepines, are some of the most addictive drugs there are in terms of the persistent withdrawal anxiety that these drugs cause.
I have been in the position of having to withdraw a number of people from benzodiazepines that I didn't put on them, obviously. And it's difficult. It's really difficult.
Prescription benzodiazepines, I think, are much more dangerous and much harder to come off of for the patient than the street drugs are.
But survivors will tell you that benzodiazepines are not the only class of psychotropic drug that is extremely hard to withdraw from.
I had about a 10-year time frame in my life where I abused both street drugs and prescription drugs. And the drugs that were the hardest to come off of, in my opinion, were the psychiatric medications. And I mean worse to come off of than a drug like heroin.
Withdrawal symptoms from the psychiatric drugs just made my mind go crazy. I couldn't think. I couldn't form coherent thoughts whatsoever.
I was racing. I had highs and lows, ups and downs, hot and cold sweats.
I went through seizures. I was sweating with night sweats so bad I was wetting my bed just with sweat.
I had tremors really bad. I mean, I joked that I looked like I had the end stages of Parkinson's disease. But you couldn't even hold me still when I was going through withdrawals. My legs would shake. I couldn't sleep.
No one in the world should have to go through what I went through, in my opinion, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
Even newborns born to women taking psychotropics while pregnant can undergo withdrawal. These infants could experience irritability, hyperactivity, abnormal sleep patterns, vomiting, diarrhea, and failure to gain weight. But it is the amplification of certain side effects caused by withdrawal from psychotropics that can have a disastrous effect on the individual.
Now the person stops taking the drug, and the effects of the withdrawal or the effects of stop taking the drug are increased and amplified symptoms like the depression or suicide ideas, or etc.
They have tremendous mood swings. They invariably get violent. And they cannot control their emotions.
You're very depressed, you're suicidal, you're hallucinating, you're psychotic, you're crazy, you're manic when you stop taking your medication.
My name is Robin, and currently I am withdrawing from lorazepam, and I am at the 0.4 milligram dose. There we go. Today, I was totally exhausted. I've had 4 nights, 2 nights of insomnia, and then a good night's sleep, then 2 nights of insomnia. Well, just hoping that I can sleep better tonight. Didn't sleep good last night. Well, as you can see, today I don't care. I did not get ready, and my wave went down. I'm down in the valley today. One of the side effects or withdrawal symptoms for lorazepam can be night sweats or hot flashes, a little lightheaded and kind of dizzy, anxiety, sore throat, weepy, very, very tired, grouchy, just overwhelmed, distraught, distressed. I began to experience suicidal thoughts. I think I've said a little bit to my husband, but he was already worried enough. This is really the first time I'm saying something about it. I feel like I could have a nervous breakdown. There are just times like I hit a brick wall and I can't do it anymore. It's going to take another, maybe 18, 19, 20 weeks to get off of it. And that is very overwhelming to me. I'm weary today, and this is how I used to be for many weeks with lorazepam. And that's the hardest thing, is you are trapped into living it out the way you have to live it out in order to be safe. So that's frustrating. I just want my life back. And that's where I am today.
It took months for Robin to wean herself off just one of her psychiatric drugs. And addiction specialists agree that slowly withdrawing is the only safe way. And yet psychiatrists tell us that psychotropic drugs are the only way to keep people from insanity and alleviate mental distress. But the truth is coming out. 14 U.S. state laws now severely restrict the psychiatric labeling and drugging of children. And a 2004 federal law prohibits school personnel from forcing parents to medicate their sons or daughters with psychotropics. Meanwhile, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has slapped their black box warning label on antidepressants for suicide in children and teenagers, and another warning on stimulants for heart attack, stroke, and sudden death in people of all ages. On another front, psychiatric survivors are now successfully pursuing legal remedies for the crippling effects of psychotropic drugs. Since 2005, there have been 50,000 individual product liability and personal injury lawsuits filed against drug companies for damage caused by psychotropic drugs, an average of 34 suits a day. Eli Lilly, accused of illegally marketing its antipsychotic Zyprexa, has paid out more than $2.5 billion in settlements to 34 states and 31,000 plaintiffs. In 2009, drug maker Pfizer agreed to forfeit over $2.3 billion, in part for colluding with a psychiatric front group to illegally market its antipsychotic, Geodon. The court system is just one area where people are speaking out. You too can help by sharing this documentary with coworkers, clients, patients, friends, and loved ones. In doing so, you will answer our final question. What can I do to protect our world from the scourge of psychiatry and psychotropic drugs? Get the facts at cchr.org. Founded in 1969 by the Church of Scientology, the Citizens Commission on Human Rights investigates and exposes psychiatric violations of human rights. Its international headquarters in Los Angeles, California, serves as a public information clearinghouse, documenting psychiatry's invasive and harmful practices and publishing its findings in 17 languages. CCHR has distributed more than 12 million copies to healthcare professionals, government officials, educators, and business leaders around the world. While the documentaries and public service announcements it's produced have appeared on television and across the internet, informing nearly 200 million people with the facts about psychiatry and psychotropic drugs. CCHR International also operates a hotline to provide free assistance to individuals who find themselves caught up in the mental health system. What is today a global human rights movement began more than 30 years ago with a fight for the freedom of one individual, Victor Ghiori, forcibly committed to a Pennsylvania psychiatric hospital. The hospital psychiatrist claimed Ghiori was babbling incoherently and diagnosed him a paranoid schizophrenic. But Ghiori wasn't insane. He was speaking Hungarian. CCHR filed a lawsuit against the hospital and its abusive psychiatric treatment. Their defense of Ghiori was so tenacious that in the middle of the case, the psychiatrist running the hospital stood up and announced, "We want nothing more to do with Victor Ghiori." Securing Victor Ghiori's release was the first of thousands of cases championed by CCHR. In apartheid South Africa, CCHR exposed secret psychiatric work camps where tens of thousands of Africans were imprisoned, drugged, electroshocked, and then farmed out as slave labor. When apartheid ended, CCHR presented testimony to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, resulting in a government inquiry into psychiatric racism. In Australia, CCHR exposed a psychiatric practice called deep sleep treatment. Patients were given a cocktail of barbiturates and psychiatric drugs. They were then given electroshock treatment, sometimes twice daily, without their knowledge. Deep sleep treatment caused 48 deaths and damaged hundreds more. CCHR investigated it, exposed it, and fought until deep sleep treatment was banned and its victims compensated. In Italy, CCHR, working with legislators and the media, conducted raids on psychiatric hospitals, the conditions of which were barbaric. CCHR persisted until those institutions were closed. In Japan, CCHR exposed patient abuse and the financial crimes of psychiatrists and hospitals, defrauding the government and taxpayers of millions. The guilty were convicted of fraud, and patient protections were implemented. And in the United States, CCHR uncovered a billion-dollar fraud in the nation's largest chain of private mental health facilities. 600 federal agents conducted raids across 20 states. Dozens of prosecutions ensued, millions of dollars in fines imposed, and the entire chain of corrupt hospitals was permanently closed. And the list goes on. In Australia, France, Germany, Hungary, and the United Kingdom, CCHR has not only been responsible for closing thousands of abusive psychiatric facilities, but at the same time, they have restored patient rights all over the world. And it was CCHR that sounded the alarm about the dangers of psychiatric drugs, resulting in public warnings about their use, such as in Europe, where its medicines agency slapped antidepressants with suicide warning labels. South Africa, where the government now warns elderly citizens about the risks associated with taking antipsychotics. And the United States and Mexico, where thanks to CCHR's efforts in promoting the Child Medication Safety Act, parents can no longer be forced to give their children psychotropic drugs. All told, CCHR is responsible for nearly 200 laws and 300 official drug warnings, safeguarding the public from the dangers of the psychiatric pharmaceutical industry. Wherever and whenever psychiatrists abuse human rights, CCHR takes its message to the streets. From the United States to Japan, and from Canada to the United Kingdom, members of CCHR lead marches to secure the protection and freedom from psychiatric abuse for everyone. Today, CCHR has over 150 chapters in 30 countries, with thousands of members joined together to defend human rights against psychiatric abuse. It is a fight that will continue until psychiatry's abusive and coercive practices cease and human rights and dignity are returned to all. If you need help or to report psychiatric abuse, go to cchr.org.